Hi, welcome to today's episode on Fast Intelligent Care. We'll be talking about the ultimate guide to bed assessments. We'll be talking about beds such as your profiling beds, electric beds, or your high-low or height adjustable beds, and some assessment considerations using the PEO model, the person, environment, occupation model, and how your assessment connects to your bed features or bed needs, and some common mistakes and what to watch out for when you are assessing your client for a bed. So let's go into our PEO model, person, environment, occupation. So let's first start with the person. When we look at the person, we think about physical limitations, their bed mobility, height, their weight, pressure injury risk, things like cognition, upper limb function, and even some medical conditions like edema or swelling. So when we think about physical limitations, we can think about, can they sit up and move in bed? Are they able to lift their legs? Are they able to get their leg into the bed once they've sat over the edge of the bed? What is their bed mobility like? Can they roll? Can they adjust their position? Can they go from lying in supine to side lying and back again? Can they go from in a lying position to sitting over the edge of the bed? And can they sit up independently in the bed, or do they need assistance from the bed to help keep them in an upright seated position? Or do they need the bed to elevate them into the seating position? When we look at things like cognition, we want to know if someone is able to use the handset of the bed. Are they able to understand the possible precautions? Are they able to understand any risks? For example, if I elevate the head end of my bed too much, so past 30 degrees, I will find that my client will start sliding down the bed, have a lot of shear and friction on their tailbone, on their heels, and this is going to contribute to pressure injuries. Something that's important for the client to understand, or even for caregivers, is that they need to do the knee brake function before they elevate the head, and to not elevate it past 30 degrees if it's not needed. Obviously, if you have a client that has breathing restrictions, or if you have a client that needs to sit upright for eating in bed, you might need to go past the 30 degrees, but then understanding that there is that risk of them sliding and using the knee brake to stop the pelvis from sliding forward. And that's something that will require the client to have that cognition, but possibly also having training with caregivers. And then also, do we understand any medical conditions that might influence our bed prescription? So this could be someone that has swelling in their legs or edema. We might need to have what we call a vascular leg raise, where we can lift up the bottom part of the bed, so by the foot end, so that the legs can be elevated, so we can get the heels higher than the heart or in line of the heart, so that fluid can go back to the heart. We also might need to understand someone's pressure injury risk, because if someone has a very high risk of pressure injuries, especially if someone is not very mobile, we might need to use the bed to help reposition them, to help redistribute pressure. We might need to look at different pressure redistribution features, such as using the knee brake to take pressure away from the heels and rather have it over the calves, preventing shear with your knee brake as well. We can also look at if we need other pressure redistribution features, such as auto-regression, which we'll go into detail in our next episode. We also want to understand if our client has any restrictions in terms of movement or pain. Do we need to be able to get them gradually into a position by using the bed features? When we think about upper limb function, the reason we want to know our client's upper limb function is because we want to know if it's possible for them to be able to use a overhead self-help pull. So this could be to pull themselves forward and assist caregivers with applying a sling behind them. We can look at a bed rail or bed pull, which can help with rolling or bed mobility, or even with getting into a seated position on the edge of the bed. And we also want to think about the client's weight, because we need to make sure that the bed is obviously within the safe working load for that client's needs, but we want to make sure that we look at the size of the bed as well. If we have a really large client, we want to make sure that there's sufficient space on the bed for them to be able to roll, because there are cases where a client will be on a very small, let's say it's a single bed, and they don't feel comfortable to roll in the bed, so their bed mobility decreases because they're concerned of falling off the bed, and they might keep waking up every time they need to reposition out of fear of falling, and that's disrupting their sleep quality, but also reducing their repositioning throughout the night, which is then increasing their pressure injury risk. Then when we look at the environment, we have a few things that we need to look at, such as the room size. Is our bed compatible with other equipment? Do we have under the bed clearance? And do we have access around the bed for our caregivers to support the client? So when we talk about room size, the reason we want to know what the room size is so that we can make sure that the bed is positioned in a good position for caregivers to be able to access the client or support the client. If you have a really small room, typically the bed gets placed along the side of the wall, and then you only have access to the client on one side of the bed. And this is something that could make manual handling more difficult. So you need to make sure that room size is taken into account, but also what your room layout looks like. So ideally you want to have access on both sides of the bed. When we talk about compatibility with other equipment, this could be things like your hoists, where we want to be able to get the hoist legs underneath the bed. So that could be where we need a high, low or height adjustable bed so that we can get those legs underneath, and look at what the frame of the bed looks like. Is there a bar at the bottom of the bed that restricts that movement of the hoist? Because we want to make sure that we can get the hoist as close as possible to the person so that the boom reaches far enough into the middle of the bed and the spreader bar is in the middle where the patient is. If we have a really big bed, but we have a hoist that doesn't have a long boom reach or can't get close enough to the person because of restrictions, we do have the risk of the hoist not being able to lift up the person from the middle of the bed. And when the sling is applied with them being in the middle of the bed, but the boom and the spreader bar are kind of off towards the edge of the bed, once you attach your sling loops and the person starts getting hoisted, they're going to swing out of bed. Or you're going to have the risk of a caregiver slamming in the hoist into the side of the bed to try and get as close as possible, and then possibly damaging the bed, damaging the actuator of the hoist, and possibly even causing injuries to themselves or the client. But if you have a client that is independently repositioning, it's not as much of an issue if the bed is placed up against the wall, or if they do have a bigger bed, because they can get out of the bed independently. But it is important to consider, are they going to require support with turning in the bed, because then the environment is going to be really important. You also want to look at access with casters on the bed, because your beds will typically have casters on all four sides. If you have a bed up to the wall, you might not be able to put on the brakes for the casters that are against the wall, and that will make it then possibly unsafe if it's unbraked. So unbraked casters, that's where you might need to look at something like a tandem brake, where brakes can be engaged from one side of the bed and still make sure that all four casters are braked. So this is where your room limitations come in, and thinking about your transfer method that you are using. So do I need to have a hoist, and what type of hoist am I using? And even looking at what is the height of the legs of the hoist to make sure that that is going to have sufficient bed clearance. When we look at the occupation, we're looking at the method that the person is transferring out of the bed. We're looking at what assistance they need with transfers. We're looking at how they reposition. Do they need to reposition with support? Are they repositioning independently? And can the bed be placed at a safe working height for caregivers? So that would be to try and get the bed nice and high up. If we do need to be able to apply a sling for hoist transfers, or being able to adjust the bed height for the person to be able to be more independent with their sit to stand transfers, where the bed will maybe assist with lifting them up a little bit higher so they're not having to stand up from a very low position. Or it could even be having to bring the bed very low so that they can lift very heavy legs into the bed. So if they have swelling in their legs, having the bed positioned really low, there's less distance for them to travel with their legs to get their legs onto the bed. So we can really look at how the features of the bed can assist us with that. So let's do a recap of today's episode. So we used the PEO model, person, environment, occupation, to talk about our bed assessment considerations. So with the person, we went through things like physical limitations, bed mobility, height, weight, their risk of pressure injury, cognition, and even some specific medical conditions like edema. We went through environment considerations such as room size, compatibility of other equipment, as well as access around the bed for caregivers. We went through occupation, which is the method of transferring in and out of bed, the assistance they need with transfers, and also safe working height for caregivers. In our next episode, we'll break down some of our pressure care features that we can get in our beds, as well as fall prevention features. So stay tuned for the next episode. If you have any experience with profiling beds, electric beds, high-low beds, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Thank you, and see you next time.